My next guest is Dr. Douglas Reeves. Douglas Reeves is the author of more than 30 books and over 100 articles on education and leadership. Twice named to the Harvard University Distinguished Authors Series, Doug is a recipient of many national and international awards for his contributions to education. He's worked in 50 states and more than 40 countries. His most recent books include Fearless Schools, Building Trust and Resilience for Learning, Teaching and Leading and Achieving Equity and Excellence. Welcome to the podcast, Doug.
Thanks so much. I'm happy to be with you.
Well, tell me about a time when you were in the trenches and managed to crawl out.
Well, I think COVID was certainly something that resonates with all of us. In March of 2020, we really didn't know what was going to be happening. And what we did during COVID to crawl out and hopefully help others is that we provided free webinars to more than 40,000 people in those dark days of the spring of 2020 and the summer and the fall when nobody was doing much in the way of professional learning and it was hard to be together. But my colleagues and I knew that learning still has to happen and that we as teachers need to set a good example for the people who are in classrooms and the same for leaders. So we continued the professional learning at no cost. And that really, I think showed who my colleagues are as committed people, not just as members of our organization. But very early on, my first teaching job, I took over in the middle of the year because my predecessor had simply walked out of the building, couldn't handle middle school kids, and I could. So I was able to be lucky enough to have a great principal and wonderful students. And so I lucked into that. And even earlier in my career, I served in the military for 5 years and plenty of times there that I had to kind of figure my way out of things. So I've had I regard it as good luck to have a lifetime of opportunities for resilience.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot of stories. And I was one of those educators that took advantage of those free webinars. And, it's so great to be able to have the connections and have that learning opportunity during the dark days of the beginning of the pandemic. So yeah, and I've heard several stories of other educators who have kind of taken over a job mid-year, and that was their first teaching experience. But as you said, you had a principal who supported you, and you were able to kind of just transition easily into that role.
Yeah, I was really lucky, and just it's never easy, but we all know what it's like to be a first-year teacher. I have a superintendent friend who told me during COVID, he said, we're all first-year teachers now. So it's good for us as veterans to empathize with what our first-year teachers are going through.
Yeah, that's definitely been kind of that vein that's been repeated, and everybody was kind of learning over. And I think all that professional learning that's provided has really helped everybody kind of dig out their niche during the pandemic. So I wanted to highlight a few of your newest books. So something that you did besides conducting webinars during the pandemic was write a lot. So first one I wanted to
everyone else cleaned their closets. I wrote books. So my closet still is horrible, but at least I did write a couple of books.
Yeah. So I wanted to talk about Fearless Schools and what it talks about what it takes to have fearless schools and psychological safety. So let's dig a little bit into just the concept of fearless schools.
Sure. The essence of it is that you can only learn when you can make mistakes, and you can make mistakes without blame, without humiliation, without embarrassment. Think of a toddler learning to walk. Nobody criticizes a toddler when they fall down, but rather they cheer every time they get back up. That's the essence of what resilience is. And it's true for kids and it's true for adults. I also want to acknowledge my intellectual debt to Professor Amy Edmondson at the Harvard Business School, who wrote The Fearless Organization. She has done her work in medical care and hospitals. I adapted her work for education. So I just, every time I talk about this, I need to honor other scholars who have gone before me in other fields and really appreciate how I've been able to adapt their work to education. I think the other issue for fearless schools is that I think most teachers know that our classrooms have to be fearless. It's got to be okay to make mistakes. That's how learning happens. I worry about the message that some teachers get from observers that say, isn't it a great classroom when everyone's quiet, when everybody who raises their hand magically has the right answer? I think that's a terrible classroom. What you want is for people to be able to make mistakes. The teacher can call on anybody, and when they do make a mistake, kids joyfully and collaboratively fix the mistake and learn. That's what a great practice looks like, whether it's athletics or an algebra class. And that's what I'm trying to create for both students and for adults.
And I think that's kind of how we've looked at things in recent years, especially as we're coming out of the pandemic, with letting kids know it's okay to fail forward, right? And I think previous generations, it's been a lot of focus on, you have to have the right answer when you raise your hand. But we're all learning and growing, and also for the adults, right? Not having that fixed mindset with teaching, but having that growth mindset. And
Yeah, props to Carol Dweck for fixed and
mhm,
growth mindset. We've been
yeah,
talking about that for 20 years, and I
yeah,
really respect her research. But I can't tell you the number of teachers and administrators that I've seen
mhm,
who talk a good game about a growth mindset, but then ask them what happened the last time somebody had a failure. And
mhm,
it's not pretty. They don't
yeah,
say, oh, gee, we learned from it. We celebrated it. I can think of literally a superintendent, Dr. Mike Wasta, who used to send out oopsgrams, he called them, talking about his own mistakes and how the
mhm,
whole system can learn from it. You can count on a very few fingers the number of superintendents who are willing to publicly talk about their mistakes rather than those who have to act as if they're the perfect hero.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, and that's a great way to lead, is like, even the leader makes mistakes, right? But yeah, I mean, I can't think of anybody I've worked with that would actually really admit to that growth mindset, and you do make mistakes even when you're a leader like that. So yeah, you talked a little bit about the teachers and the students in the classroom, but um when you're giving webinars or training with schools on fearless schools, what is your message to leaders that are either school leaders or district leaders?
Well, we are really good in education about talking a good game
Mhm.
theoretically, but
Yeah.
never turning it into practice. So I'm a
Mhm.
very practical guy. And what I want to do is take the research that I think is pretty extensive on psychological safety and fearlessness and turn it into practice. So let me illustrate with a couple of examples. Number one, when it comes to the classroom, I'm a big believer in equity sticks. You see
Mhm.
this with kindergarten, first and second graders, in the primary grades a lot. And just for our listeners who are not familiar with that, equity sticks literally mean like little popsicle sticks with a picture of kids in the name.
Mhm.
And the teacher will pose a question and give everybody a minute of think time. And then they
Mhm.
said, going to call on me? Is she going to call on me? And
Mhm.
then she picks an equity stick out of the barrel and calls on somebody. It has 100% engagement. It's joyful. Nobody is humiliated. Nobody's put in the spot.
Mhm.
But later on in elementary school, and almost invariably in secondary school, the only time interaction happens is when somebody raises their hand.
Yeah.
And that means that Maria's in the front row. She's got her hands raised. So Doug in the back row can say, hey, Maria's got this covered. I don't need to engage. I don't need to participate. That is the opposite of effective learning.
Mhm.
So one practical thing I want to see is equity sticks literally in every classroom. I know college professors who are starting to do this now. Now, they don't use popsicle sticks, although I
Mhm.
don't think that's a bad idea, but they do random calling, but it's the same principle. Everybody is engaged. Everybody has a probability of being called on, and nobody is humiliated. So
Mhm.
that's one big idea. When it comes to adult learning, I think we need to do the same thing. When I conduct adult seminars, I do random calling. And
Mhm.
I hope that anybody who has been in one of my seminars know that they're never humiliated. They're never embarrassed. I always have techniques like you can phone a friend, you can have a group response, you can answer a question with a question. You can say, Doug, I need a minute of think time. But what
Mhm.
I'm not going to do is let somebody check out and the
Mhm.
same people answer the same questions all the time. So we
Mhm.
can do this. There are specific things that we can do for adults and kids to promote fearlessness.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, and I think that's a great pedagogical strategy. I remember often falling into that trap of only calling all the kids that raise their hands. And when you're seeing the same kids, you don't want to just have those kids raise their hand. But yeah, those sticks, I've used those at times. And even using that with adult learners, as you said, right? We don't want to put adult learners on the spot, because sometimes adult learners are the worst students, right?
Yes.
They're not always paying attention in some of those seminars. But yeah, giving them the chance to phone a friend or find the answer a different way is an excellent idea. Let's talk a little bit about the other book you released last year, Achieving Equity and Excellence, and a little bit of how teachers and leaders can use some of the ideas in that book in their classrooms and schools.
Well, the research that I'm probably best known for is the 90-90-90 studies of schools that were 90% poverty, 90% ethnic or linguistic minority, and 90% meeting or exceeding state standards. And it was time for an update. So what achieving equity and excellence is all about is updating success in high poverty schools. 20 years ago, I was kind of a lone wolf in that research. Now there's many researchers, and I specifically want to honor people like Karen Chenoweth of Ed Trust, who's had 5 books from Harvard Ed Press on this subject of success in high poverty schools. And she was gracious enough to footnote my work. I want to return the favor and acknowledge the great work that she has done. Heather Zadofsky in talking about a work on scale. Stephen Graham, who has done astounding work on the specific issue of equity and excellence, on what do you do technically to make that happen, and what do high poverty, high success schools do differently. So it's not just about my research, it's really the preponderance of the evidence. So that's big idea number one. And big idea number two is that research is most credible when it's robust and when it's replicable. So when it's just one person's story, people say, yeah, that was great, but it doesn't apply to us. When you see it repeated again and again, rural, urban, suburban. And interestingly, in this book, not only does it work in high poverty schools, what I found in the intervening years since I started the research is that some of these same techniques are effective in low poverty schools. So in other words, it's not about demographics, it's about good education. To illustrate with a couple of examples, things like nonfiction writing, dramatically associated with better achievement and equity. And by equity, I don't mean feeling sorry for kids, I mean having excellent results. The collaborative scoring is another great example. I should just say one more thing about the title. I didn't know when I wrote this how controversial the term equity would become, because it's been roundly criticized and associated with some unfortunately crazy ideas. So I want to be really clear with your audience, particularly board members, parents, policymakers who have heard the term equity criticized. I use the Ken Williams definition. Equity is giving students what they need, when they need it, with urgency. And I always use the terms equity and excellence together. Because when board members and parents think that equity means low expectations, they're going to veto anything that has the word equity. In my world, in my colleagues' world, equity is always about high achievement. It's all about academic excellence and behavioral excellence. It's not about making excuses. It's not about sympathy and low expectations. So I think it's really important to make that clear. We do our high poverty children no favors by saying in the name of equity, we'll lower our expectations. They may need extra help. They need extra support. If we've got a bunch of third graders in this country who can't read, let's give them, as Mr. Williams says, what they need, when they need it, with urgency. Not feel sorry for them, give them what they need.
Yeah, and that's a great thing to point out. And I had Ken Williams on the podcast about a year ago. Yeah, so
well,
yeah, I can,
not surprisingly, he's ahead of me.
Yeah, I can refer people back to that episode to hear a little bit more about his work. But yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out. And like you're saying, some of these strategies can be used both in all types of demographics, right? And it's tell me a little bit more about some of the nonfiction writing. Kind of what are the strategies? Would that be for the K-12 or is it focused more on a secondary or certain grades?
No, it's literally starts in kindergarten. So I love elaborating on this because I'll hear people say, "Oh, gee, writing is not developmentally appropriate for kindergartners." I have been in high poverty schools at the kindergarten level where every single kindergartner is writing. And some of them don't know how to make their letters yet. Some of them use pretty inventive spelling, I must say. But man, those kids are writing from day one. And by the end of kindergarten, they're writing sentences. They use a technique where they'll start with a big picture and just a couple of words or letters. But as the year goes on, the picture gets smaller and the number of lines gets larger. If you've read Lucy Calkins' work, she does amazing work. And she is also deeply committed to excellence with kids writing. And it's particularly nonfiction writing to describe, to compare, to evaluate, to persuade. I ran an elementary school newspaper club for 5 years. Don't let anybody tell elementary kids don't like nonfiction writing. They love nonfiction writing, particularly when they get famous for it in the school newspaper. So, and I would just tie this in a bow by saying it's not just an ELA. Our ELA teachers at the secondary level and the ELA block in elementary school is already crowded, catching up on reading. If you want to do nonfiction writing, it belongs to everybody. And I've worked in this wonderful district in Lima, Ohio, very high poverty, but they're middle school kids, man, they write in music, in art, in math, in science, in social studies. Everybody writes, and you can just watch with your own eyes how the writing gets more elaborate, more complex year by year. And so when I see fourth and fifth graders writing excellently, it makes me pretty intolerant when somebody says, oh, gee, an eighth grader can't do that. Yes, they can. It's not about the kids. It's about our expectations.
And I think that's true. Like you're giving kids something to roll with, right? You're giving them an idea, you give them the time, you give them a format or a rubric, but they have a lot of imagination. So it's letting them run with that imagination and having belief in them. Like you said, those kindergartners, picture gets smaller by the end of the year. It doesn't matter if everything's spelled correctly.
And back to being super practical about this, you never get it right the first time. As you kindly said in the introduction, I've written a lot of books and a lot of articles. I've never had a first draft accepted by anybody. And even when a well-established author still has to do rewriting, then I think it's fair for K-12 students to expect to rewrite as well. And that is such an incredibly important technique, because when I interviewed college teachers about what should we do in K-12 to prepare our students for college, and this is a question I hear from parents all the time: will this help my kid get ready for college? They said two big things. Number one, send us kids who can take and use feedback and don't crumble under it. And secondly, send us kids who can do writing, not just in English class, but in biology, in engineering, in economics, and so on. So this is a really good idea that doesn't just emerge from studies of high poverty schools, but really applies to every listener in helping our students get better for the world of work and the world of college.
Yeah, that's so important. Let's talk a little bit about some of your current work with districts and state level leaders and what that looks like now. Are you doing a lot still virtually or some in-person work? And what would a typical maybe assignment that you have with a district look like?
I'm doing a lot of work personally. I've been on the road since January of 2021. This is an unusual week where I'll get to be at home all week, but next week I'll be back on the road in California, then in New York. So I'm coast to coast doing it. I have not done, I used to do a lot of international work. Hopefully that will open up again next year, but I'm still traveling very aggressively. I also do a lot of webinars and a lot of electronic work. Specifically, the sort of thing that I think has made, I hope, my colleagues and me a little bit distinctive is that we're working on inside out change. In other words, we take what we call the science fair approach. So let's take a very controversial subject like grading. If you go in and say, hey, here's Doug's best ideas on grading, smash it down, it'll get undermined every time because it's a very emotional topic. Teachers and parents and a lot of students don't like changing that. So I don't ask them to do it my way. What I ask them to do is, let's focus on what the issue is, like a super high failure rate in grade 9 math or grade 10 science. And let's think of different ways to address that. And then we conduct a science fair. Different teachers try different things. And for example, when Mr. Dahl, who's a magnificent math teacher in a high poverty system in California, used to have literally huge failure rates, more than half of the kids failing 9th and 10th grade mathematics. And he made a couple of changes, like, well, I'm not going to use the average. I'm going to use how they finish the semester, not how they start. And I'm going to get the practice done in class rather than having all the practice done at home when I don't even know who's doing the work. Little changes. Then Mr. Dahl is able to show his colleagues, well, gee, I had an 80% reduction in my D and F rate. Plus I had better attendance, fewer tardies, better classroom engagement, better behavior. If I said that, it would be some out-of-towner from Boston trying to tell them what to do. When Mr. Dahl says it, then it has credibility because it's teacher to teacher. So that's, to answer your question, exactly what I do. I don't try to impose my will. I share the research, but ultimately what lasts is inside out change, proving to our listeners, this is what works in your school, with your culture, with your labor agreement, with your community. That's the way you make change happen.
Yeah, and I totally see that, how somebody could bring in somebody like you and, just follow what you say. And then how long is that really going to last, right? It's when you're looking at the district and digging deeper and seeing these are the reasons for such, and looking specifically at those classes, like you said, have the teacher do their own data analysis of how things are working, right? But yeah, cater it towards the client that you're working with, instead of catering it towards your expectations, and then it doesn't always work, and they go back to the same old, same old.
I mean, there's a long tradition in education of thinking that you can make change happen with the drive-by. And I wrote an article in Ed Leadership about, how has professional learning changed? And number one was bye-bye to the drive-by. Because I'll go to play, well, Doug, come in and give a speech. Well, what do you really want to achieve?
Yeah.
Well, we want you to give a speech. No. What do you want to achieve? What do you want to change? And well, we've had, and these people are all friends of mine, so no criticism intended. We had Bob Marzano, we had Tom Gusky, we had Ken O'Connor, we had Joe Feldman. So what do you think is going to be any different when I am just the fifth guy in the merry-go-round?
Yeah.
You got to stop having the drive-by. You got to start doing intensive problem solving, and the teachers need to be the stars of the show. When they show it works with our community, that's going to be 10 times more persuasive than a speech from me.
Yeah, that's so important to remember. Well, having worked with schools for so many years, and a variety of different settings, what are some of your biggest ahas and changes in education during the past 3 to 5 years, not just during the pandemic, but a little bit prior to that?
I would say the number one aha for me, and I wrote about this in a different book, Deep Change Leadership, and it's probably one of the most controversial findings that I've had, but I'm not there to, Harry Truman said, they say that I'm giving them hell, and all I do is tell the truth, and they think it's hell. Well, here's an example of that. I don't think buy-in works. Or you ask most people, and they learned this in graduate school. They've got a PhD in leadership from Harvard. Well, first, Doug, you got to get buy-in.
Yeah.
And people who believe that will still be having attempts to change that will be entirely futile 50 years from now. Buy-in doesn't work. What works is inside out change, where you don't ask for buy-in. You ask for a fair experiment. That's why I use the science fair analogy. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm not asking for buy-in, because the illusion that leaders have is some inspirational speaker is going to create buy-in, and teachers will, after 25 years of teaching, saying, oh, now I recognize I've been doing it wrong. I shall go back and do things differently. That never happens. The way change happens is not through buy-in, but through practice. And Tom Gusky, by the way, who I mentioned a minute ago, has a superior article in the November issue of Educational Leadership that's all about efficacy. And what Gusky said in this article, and Tom, I think, is one of the foremost researchers of our generation. And what Professor Gusky says is, you want to really build efficacy, you don't do it with speeches and workshops and books. You do it with experiences. Let people see that they had an impact, and then they've got efficacy that lasts. So, people like Tom and myself and others that I've mentioned are all into the real world of practical application, not into emotional inspiration. Yeah. But I will tell you, despite that aha for me, there's a lot of people, and I hear this from business people as well. The first thing you got to do if you want change, Doug, is you got to get buy-in from everybody. No, you don't. Sorry to say, no, you don't.
Yeah, and that's really important for leaders to remember, because they're always talking about that. Well, I want to use this initiative. I want to bring in so-and-so speaker, right? But it's actually inside out change. And I'll put that link to Tom Gusky's article in the show notes as well.
Yeah, it's really splendid. I mean, that's one of, I'm sure, more than 100 articles that he's written, but I think this brand new one is, because a lot of people talk about efficacy, but they get it completely wrong. And just to be clear, I love going to districts. I love speaking to parents and to boards, and I do a lot of national, international speaking as well. However, I think we who do that kind of professional learning need to be very modest about the impact that we have. It's never about a speech. And if you're doing your job well, then at the end of a year of doing this kind of work, and the superintendent says, well, come give another speech, I'll say, no, I'm going to be in the cheerleading section. I
Mhm.
want the teachers and the administrators who are making it work to be up there. And my job is to encourage and support them, not just to always be the person on the platform.
Mhm.
I can start it, but I can't finish it.
Yeah, they're the ones who are doing the work in the trenches with the students.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And then, yeah, cheerleading them through the process is a great way to look at it. Well, out of everything we talked about today on the podcast, what's one thing you'd like listeners to remember?
Um, I guess if I would like our listeners to take away something in their role as teacher and as a parent and administrator, it's resilience.
Mhm.
All the things that we've talked about, if you had to tie them into one bag with one word, it's resilience, bouncing back from failure and defeat. And I think resilience is the standard by which we should measure everything that we do. Are we improving resilience? That is, no matter what your mistakes have been in the past, you can bounce back.
Mhm.
So little things like Mr. Dahl that I mentioned earlier, getting rid of the average, simple thing to build resilience. Same thing with teacher evaluation. We're all going to make mistakes. Let us bounce back and not be
Mhm.
judged in May for the mistakes that we made in October.
Mhm.
Resilience is also important for the home life of our students as well. Our kids come home sometimes bewildered and disappointed. We need to not judge them by their failures, but always talk about how do they bounce back. My models here are always music teachers and coaches, because
Mhm.
music teachers and coaches are full of a life of mistakes from which students bounce back. And I aspire to have my math classes, whether they're for little kids or graduate students studying multivariate statistics. I want my students to have the same resilience, bouncing back from disappointment, failure, as a great music director or a great coach does. Those are my models.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, and that's kind of that premise of the podcast as well. Just hearing stories of resilience, how educators have bounced back from failure. And it's so important to let our kids know, like we said at the beginning, of that growth mindset. It's okay to fail. Pointing out, especially in sports, because that's pretty evident when there's a game and a player might have done a wrong play, and that's kind of ruined the game. But we're always bouncing back from failure in games. So
Yeah,
why not, learn from that in the classroom as well?
exactly. I think sometimes people in the academic world resist sports analogies,
Mhm.
but if you look at two of the greatest coaches,
Mhm.
of the last 50 years, Pat Summitt at the University of Connecticut, more national champions than anybody, John Wooden at UCLA. I was lucky enough to speak to him, and the thing that jumps out for great coaches like that is that they don't call themselves coaches; they call themselves teachers.
Mhm. Mhm.
And if you didn't know who Coach Wooden was and you met him on an airplane, he wouldn't say, "I'm a national champion coach." He'd
Mhm.
say, "I'm a teacher." And I
Mhm.
think there's a real message from Coach Summitt and from Coach Wooden that all of us can learn from.
Mhm. Yeah, so important to remember. Well, where can people connect with you and find you online?
Sure. Creativeleadership.net. There are lots of free resources. I want to be clear that part of our mission is making sure that people all around the world, and we work in the developing world, done a lot of work in Zambia, a lot of work in Asia,
Mhm.
a lot of work in South America, all around the world have access to free videos, free research, free tools, free articles, all at creativeleadership.net. That is where they go, and they're welcome to contact me. I should mention also for your listeners, I have a volunteer group called finishthedissertation.org
Mhm.
for people working on their doctoral degree. It's free one-to-one coaching. There's a 69% of doctoral candidates never finish.
Mhm.
So if our listeners or a colleague or a loved one have people struggling with the dissertation, send them to finishthedissertation.org. And just one more, I'll bet we've got some listeners who say, Jiminy, Doug's, working on 42 books and I'm just working on my first one. How do I get that book finished? Marshwriters.org.
Okay.
Marsh, M-A-R-S-H, marshwriters.org is, again, a free writer support group, first Saturday of every month that I started. And we've had people who have gotten their first work published. Sometimes it's education, sometimes it's poetry, sometimes it's a murder mystery. It's a
Mhm.
great group. So if you're a writer who wants to get going and be encouraged, marshwriters.org, those are all places where people can contact me, and I try to be as supportive as I can.
Well, that's great to hear that you're involved in those other spaces as well, that you're supporting educators and other people who would like to put out their first book. So I'll definitely put those in the show notes. Well, thank you so much for being on the Out of the Trenches podcast today. It was a pleasure having you on.
My great pleasure. Thanks so much.